Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui at the Beijing Forum in Peking University. George Yeo is a Singaporean who is currently Chancellor of Nalanda University in India. He was a senior politician for many years in Singapore and served as Foreign Minister from the year 2004 until 2011. He is an articulate advocate for his own country and has long been an astute observer of China and its relations with Singapore and the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. To discuss these relations and other important issues, I'm very happy to be joined here by Mr. Yeo. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Born in 1954, George Yeo is a former Singaporean politician. He was a member of the People's Action Party and served in the cabinet from 1991 to 2011. After graduating from Cambridge with an engineering degree in 1976, George Yeo served as an officer in the Singapore Armed Forces and the Republic of Singapore Air Force. Then he went on to attend Harvard and earned a master's degree in business administration in 1985. From 85 to 1988, Yeo served as the Chief of Staff of the Air Staff and the Director of Joint Operations and Planning at the Ministry of Defence. In 1988, he was elected to Parliament. And since then, George Yeo has served in various ministries, including the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Information, Communication and the Arts, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Yeo. What is the cornerstone for Singapore's foreign policy as a unique city-state?
Well, Singapore survives by being of service to others. We benefit a lot from our location and our multicultural character. And the key is we must have friends everywhere who would like to deal with us and deal through us. This is how we make a living.
Is what you say actually an understatement about keeping a good balance between different powers, particularly the relationship must be balanced between giant and major powers in the region?
Oh, this is absolutely central. We can only be a trader, be a business center, if we deal with all parties. If we deal only with some parties, but not with others, then we put ourselves at a great disadvantage.
Is that the legacy of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the late Prime Minister of your country, about the foreign relations?
No, it goes back to the days of the British East India Company, when Singapore was established for free trade, protection of property, and open to the flow of people and capital.
From your perspective, what are the most embarrassing adversity and challenges lying ahead of Singapore as China grows so fast in size and in its might, particularly the naval build-up in the Asia-Pacific region and in the broad context of back to Asia from the United States?
Singapore has always been very supportive of China's policy of reform and opening up, and China's development brings a lot of benefits to Singapore and to all the countries of Southeast Asia. In fact, I see China's development and One Belt, One Road and the growing integration between the economies of ASEAN and China as being a great blessing to the countries of Southeast Asia. This is a historic opportunity for all the countries to make a big leap in their development.
But at the same time, we're aware that Singapore has been keen on joining the TPP, which unfortunately was rejected by both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in the presidential race. Do you see your proactive efforts to join the TPP as a hedge against the growing influence of the Chinese economy in this region?
Oh, not at all. I was trade minister and was involved in establishing the TPP, which had a very modest beginning between Singapore, New Zealand and Chile. I persuaded Brunei to join. And later on, the US showed interest and other countries showed interest. At that time, I persuaded China also to join. But China felt that it had already given too many concessions for its WTO accession and wanted to wait. I thought that was a mistake because it's better to join earlier. But subsequently, China took a more positive view of the TPP.
Well, TPP is and has been pretty controversial for the Chinese observers concerning the U.S. Strategy of rebalancing China's influence in this region, and particularly President Obama's remarks that China will be viewed as an adversary unless it's following up the rules. Let's come back to examine the political legacy of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the late founding father of your country. Tell us briefly how important is his political legacy and what is it?
Well, without Lee Kuan Yew, there would not be an independent Singapore. So he was the founding father, and without him, you can't explain the Singapore of today. But the economic basis of Singapore and its role in Asia goes further back. In fact, it goes back a long time because of its geographical location. So when Admiral Zheng He went to the Western Ocean, the fleets always passed through Singapore, and Singapore was called Long Yamen, which is why when China promotes One Belt, One Road, we see a great revival of the maritime Silk Route and a huge opportunity for Singapore.
China obviously wants to become one of the blue water naval forces in the world because it has such a long coastline and growing global stakes of maritime trade. There's no doubt about that. However, China is accused of being a threat to the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. And China, most of the Chinese say, come on, this is a joke. We are the biggest beneficiary of free global trade since our entry into the WTO in the year 2001. Why should China be viewed as a threat? And obviously, you know what I'm talking about, the allegation from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House. Everybody points their finger to China as potentially a threat. What's your take?
The reason is because the Western powers, particularly the US, they see China behaving the way they behave. When the British came to Asia, when the European powers came to Asia, they opened up trade, not by cooperation, but through gunboats. And the famous US Admiral Mahan, he developed a whole strategic theory based upon sea power, which was in turn based upon the British sense of sea power. China, I think, has a different view of itself. China is not a proselytizing country. China doesn't want others to be like itself. Because if you're not a Chinese and you're a good friend of China, that's good enough. There's no need for you to become Chinese. And the Chinese approach towards foreign policy is defensive. So if China builds up a navy, I think it is principally for defensive reasons rather than for the purpose of intimidating other countries or for conquest. I mean, if that were in the nature of China, the voyages of Admiral Zheng He would have been very different.
So you are actually a naysayer to the theory of a zero-sum game?
Oh, completely. I don't believe
You're not a fan of a zero-sum game,
I don't see this inevitable to see this trap, which many Western scholars talked about. China is a growing power, but China has been seen in history again and again as a great power. This is not the first time Southeast Asia is seeing China.
Over and over, President Xi Jinping says on many occasions that what China stands for is a cohesive, inclusive plan of co-prosperity and interconnectivity between and among all the member states of the Belt and Road Initiative, maybe 60 of them in total. Yet, we could hardly find someone who's ready to listen from the United States. And they say, you might have said correctly and wisely that they examine the rise of China in the historical context of their own. So what is the solution, if any, to the current dilemma between the United States and China?
I think we need more contact, more trust. It takes time. Every crisis can either lead to more trust or less trust. And because China's nature is very different from the US, we need much more communication. There's a lot of misunderstanding about China.
How would you characterize ASEAN's ability to work as a facilitator of regional diplomacy and prosperity?
Well, ASEAN plays a very important role in larger Asia because of its strategic location between two oceans, between the two great civilizations of China and India. And historically, the kingdoms, municipalities of Southeast Asia have received layered influences from both China and India. And this is but a further addition of more layers in history. So and throughout this period, ASEAN has never threatened China. China has mostly been a friend of Southeast Asian countries.
Why do you think China has always been saying consistently that we fully respect the role that ASEAN plays in maintaining regional stability and peace, as well as, of course, prosperity? We do not want to replace ASEAN in whatever sense for its leadership in maintaining regional prosperity. Why do you think? Maybe we should look at how China was the first to call for 10+1 FTA with ASEAN, and then that was quickly followed by 10+3 and 10+6. China has always been very articulate about a constructive relationship with the ASEAN.
In fact, I was a witness to it. In the year 2000, Premier Zhu Rongji was in Singapore and proposed to the ASEAN leaders a bilateral free trade agreement between ASEAN and China. And at that time, because of the Asian financial crisis, the ASEAN leaders did not know how to respond. I was trade minister at the time, and we had intense discussions. We bargained for an early harvest. And by 2002 in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, between Zhu Rongji and the ASEAN leaders, they signed a framework agreement, and that laid the basis for good cooperation. And I remember Premier Zhu saying, China does not seek for itself an exclusive position in Southeast Asia. I thought that was very wise. In other words, Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN, they are free to have as many friends as possible. But China wants to be one of the important friends. And that's a very good situation for us to be in.
Inevitably, in our discussion, we have to look at the range of issues, including the South China Sea, the maritime disputes, and different claims of other countries. For example, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam
Brunei
in particular. So what do you think of the recent statement from the ASEAN summit in Laos, which failed to mention the July 12th ruling about the maritime dispute between the Philippines and China?
Well, the circumstances under which China was taken to compulsory arbitration are controversial. I had already left office by that time. When the Philippines took that action, I thought it was not wise. They might have good lawyers, but I didn't see how that would solve the problem, because at its essence, it is a political problem.
You mean domestic political problem for the Filipino politicians, or is it?
No,
what do you mean?
In essence, it is a political issue between China and the Philippines. It cannot be solved legally or legalistically. In any case, the way we all know the UNCLOS was established, not to establish territorial boundaries, but it was established for a different basis. At the core of the South China Sea conflict is really territory.
Are you saying in your understatement that actually the predecessor of President Duterte, Mr. Aquino III, was turning to a confrontational approach in adopting a legal battle? As you said, it won't help.
No, I do not thinking, but the Philippines and Americans have a very similar legal tradition. They invoke the law to solve many problems, and maybe they thought that was the most natural way of resolving what could not be resolved at that time politically. I respect their view for this, but I never thought it was a wise move, because I did not think that it would create better relations between Philippines and China, or between ASEAN and China.
The Philippines and the United States have been locked in animosity over Manila's war on crimes and drugs in the streets. President Duterte even used some very tough words to describe President Obama, and that caused an uproar in the media coverage about the bilateral relationship between Washington and Manila. Do you think the strong character that is implied in the presidency of Mr. Duterte threatens to derail what has been achieved so far through the Back to Asia, the whatever military maneuvers by the three countries, Australia, the United States, and Japan, is a joint patrol of the South China Sea? And do you think the Americans are extremely and obsessively concerned about the unpredictability of President Duterte? And what does that mean for ASEAN?
The relationship between the Philippines and America is a deep one, rooted in history and bound by myriad links, economic links, cultural links, political links.
And even the element of colonialism, perhaps, that could date back to 1895.
So when the Philippines did not allow the Americans to keep the bases at Clark and Subic, they used to laugh among themselves with this slogan, GI, go home, but take me with you. Because in their hearts, they like America. I thought President Aquino overshot a little bit in one direction, and I'm worried that President Duterte may be overshooting in a different direction. But even when you listen to his words, there is in him a deep disappointment that far from understanding what he's trying to do, the Americans are more interested to reprimand him, and he resents it. But do the Filipinos dislike the Americans? No, I don't think so. And the Filipino links with America are good for Southeast Asia. When I was a minister in ASEAN, as trade minister and a foreign minister, that was always an asset to us that the Philippines had particularly good relations with America.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with George Yeo, former Foreign Minister of Singapore. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, sir. Recently, President Duterte paid a state visit to China, and he was given a red carpet ceremony, of course. China promised to invest generously in the construction of infrastructure and help the Philippines to rebuild not only its economy, but above all, the most important task for President Duterte, the anti-drug center, rehabilitation center. Will this help cement the ties between Manila and Beijing? And again, let me ask you, what does that mean for ASEAN, which pays so much attention to consensus building?
No, I thought China handled that visit very well. Even though President Duterte made some very strong remarks against the US in Beijing, China did not exploit it, but handled that visit with dignity and with consideration for American dignity. I think this is very good for China's relations with Southeast Asia.
You said the Filipinos have developed a strong mixed feeling about the military presence of the United States in their own territory, in their own land. Ironically, Singapore has provided the United States with their own military bases, and that has surprised China. Recently, a debate broke out between your ambassador to China and Mr. Hu Xijin, editor-in-chief of Global Times, which is very influential at home and abroad, about the spirit of the joint statement issued by the ASEAN summit in Laos. And your ambassador said, well, our position about South China Sea is different from China, but it doesn't mean we are against China. So how do you clarify the policy of the Singaporean government, and what do you think of the debate?
The agreement to allow US forces to use facilities in Singapore was signed, I think, in 1989 or 1990, when I was a Minister of State in the Foreign Ministry. And in fact, I made that announcement in the Singapore Parliament. Singapore's primary consideration is to ensure freedom of navigation in the region, particularly through the Straits of Malacca and the Straits of Singapore, which is by far the busiest sea lane in the world, and of vital importance to China, to Japan and Korea. And the presence of the US in maintaining the freedom of navigation has always been a central consideration for Singapore. And I think China has China's interests are aligned with this. They are not against it.
But welcoming the military presence in the territory of a sovereign state is largely viewed as a strong token language and a symbol of forging an alliance with a major power. Singapore is a member state of a non-aligned movement, and yet, ironically, you provide the United States with a military base. That goes against perhaps the spirit of a non-aligned movement. Do you agree?
We don't provide the Americans with any bases. We allow the Americans to make use of our facilities. These are our bases. They come here as our guests. And this is the basis on which they operate in Singapore. The US wanted Singapore to be an ally. We told them politely that it's not necessary. We're happy just to be good friends. Just as we are good friends with China, with European powers, with India.
Despite the huge differences, from your point of view, what are the similarities, if any, between our two countries?
Well, the links are profound links. A senior Chinese diplomat, when I was foreign minister, came to see me and said between the two peoples, the people of China and the people of Singapore, there is a very strong mutual affection. And I think he described it very well. Singapore is, of course, a small country, and Singapore can't say that. But he could say that, and it touched me. And I believe this sentiment continues to underlie the relationship between China and Singapore. There are problems, of course, from time to time, but these are relatively tactical issues. On the main direction, Singapore and China are mostly aligned on the big issues.
Quiet water runs deep. What China does at this moment, I believe, is try to figure out how we should navigate our own course independently and differently in terms of engineering social, economic, and political transformation from the what we had from the former Soviet Union, the legacy of the former Soviet Union, and into a new era, which means our roadmap of social and economic development would be very different from the shock therapy that the United States prescribed in the wake of the Cold War. We would go our own way. Singapore is one good example of inspirations for many developing countries. You are known for a good government and good judgment in achieving prosperity and stability. However, do you believe Singapore is a democracy, or it's just a kind of a mode of social development with your own strong characteristics?
Democracy in the West has a very special meaning in respect to voting, the freedom of the press, in the laws governing assembly, funding, and so on. Democracy, as we translate it into Chinese, 民主, is something which we hold very dear in Singapore, and which I believe is held very dear in China. But when Western countries...
Excuse me, when you say 民主, that immediately associates the word with what American government says. People, it's a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Do you think this is the essence of democracy?
Yes, which was interpreted by Guofu, Song Zhongshan 先生, as in 三民主义. Yeah. I think that continues to be the deep value pushing China and Singapore and other countries forward. But we use democracy as a means to an end. It is not a doctrine. It is not a religion.
Currently, we see and feel the dynamics and the velocity in the anti-graft campaign that was started by President Xi Jinping. In what way can we learn from Singapore in maintaining a clean government? Some in the West accused the Chinese authorities of overreacting and being selective in launching the campaign against the corruption. What do you think of the therapy that we employ in dealing with the justice and credibility of the government?
No, for China it's absolutely necessary. The problem of corruption was getting quite bad. And if President Xi had not moved to tackle it in the decisive way, it would have led to China's decline. And I think it's very important that he succeeds, and we wish him well. Singapore has its own system of keeping out corruption, but it is a small place, and the systems we have may not be applicable to China at all.
What do you mean by rule of law? Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was by training a lawyer from Oxford University, and rule of law takes root in your country. So let me know your interpretations about the rule of law in a country like China, for example.
No, I think China has a very different legal tradition from that of the West. For the West, it is a rule of law. China, there's a tendency to see law in terms of rule by law, of laws as regulation, rather than as law being above everything else, even when the ultimate logic of law may be a perverse outcome. I think China went through this debate after Qin Shi Huang, when it decided that the correct way to order society is not through Fa, but through Li. And this continues to underlay much of Chinese society. But Fa is important. Fa is important to create predictability and order in Chinese society. Singapore adopted the system from the West, but there's a lot of li in the way we apply the law in Singapore.
It seems most of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region are afraid that they would be forced to take side with the United States or China on the security issues in this region. Singapore, of course, pursues your own independent foreign policy. Now, the issue is whether the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate the needs of the two major powers, the United States and China. Your point of view, please.
Oh, of course. I mean, I've made the point repeatedly that with the growth of China, no one in ASEAN wants China as an enemy. They want closer relations with China because there are a lot of benefits. But because China is big and they are not so big, so naturally they seek diversification. I tell my American friends and my Japanese friends that the closer a country is to China, the more it welcomes the Americans and the Japanese also to be present. Then they have more room to play. And this is Southeast Asia strategy, this is ASEAN strategy, to be friendly to everybody, to have good relations with China and also to have good relations with all the others. Maintain a neutral platform so everybody feels that he's fairly treated in Southeast Asia. And that should always be ASEAN's position, to be neutral, to be friendly to all parties.
You speak of Tokyo, and that reminds me of a third party that may have enslaved the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. The third party is Japan. Now we have Diaoyu Islands, we have different interpretations about the history and the issue of comfort women, to say nothing of Diaoyu Islands. You maintain a good relationship with Japan. What's for Mr. Shinzo Abe, who agrees to join the naval patrols in the South China Sea, and it's this man, Mr. Shinzo Abe, who wanted to rewrite the pacifist constitution, causing worries from ROK and the PRC at the same time.
The Chinese people in Singapore were staunch supporters of the anti-Japanese war. And Singapore became a rallying point for overseas Chinese support on the mainland, and paid a very heavy price for it, because when the Japanese army invaded Singapore, the second biggest site of the massacre of civilians after Nanjing was in Singapore. And till today, there are still many places in Singapore which are thought by local people to be haunted because of what the Japanese militarists did there in those places. So there's no doubt that Singaporeans generally take a certain view about Yasukuni Shrine and about history. And on these issues, our position has been repeated many times. And Prime Minister Abe knows our position on these issues. But Japan is a friendly power to Singapore. Their investments are important to us, and we have good relations with them. But we do not compromise on the principles of history.
We'll keep this in mind. We do not compromise on history. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Yeo. Thanks a lot. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.